Wow. How do you follow that? But we'll give it a try. So uh, we're very fortunate today to have I think, a very special person in the audience. And that's actually a fifth generation descendant of the Donner Party. Marlene Cowan, who you met earlier, stand up. She is a fifth generation of the George Donner family. So a very special occasion. So I love the parody. Thank you so much. And actually, I'm not going to talk about the Sierra Nevada. We're going to talk about what happened back up the trail, so to speak. And to do that, I want to start by hearing from one of the survivors.
Oh, Mary, I have not wrote you half of the trouble we have had, but I have wrote you enough to let you know what trouble is. But thank God, and the only family that did not eat human flesh. We have left everything, but I don't care for that. We have got through with our lives. But don't let this letter dishearten anybody. Never take no cutoffs, and hurry along as fast as you can. Virginia Elizabeth Beckenstowe Reed, May 16th, 1847.
Those are pretty gut-wrenching words from a girl of 13 years and 10 months of age, to have survived what she did. As an introduction, I am a docent at the Sunnyvale Heritage Park Museum. I'm also a researcher there. And I encourage you, if you get a chance, to come by and visit us. We talk about the history of the Murphy Party and Sunnyvale. I joined the museum in 2023 as a docent. I'm going to tell you right up front, I'm not a historian. I'm not a teacher. I hold degrees in computer science and mathematics, but I do have a boundless curiosity, as Ellie will tell you, that I like to explore stuff. So, the Donner Party. I can imagine if I asked for a show of hands, there would not be a single person in this room that has not heard of the Donner Party. And as I mentioned, we're not going to talk about what happened in the Sierra Nevada. Hundreds of books, thousands of videos, millions of pages have been written about it. But what we are going to do is talk about what led to their demise, I believe, earlier on. And they had lots of things going against them. They had a late start, but they weren't the latest. In fact, James Clyman, after he was headed east from Fort Laramie, would count another 69 wagons behind them and another 21 pack mule teams. They didn't have a guide with them. And by 1846, this wasn't a huge issue. The trail was established enough, so it wasn't a big one. They had conflicted leadership. George Donner was the designated leader of the party, but if you've ever read anything about James Fraser Reed, you know he was quite vocal about how he thought things should be run. And they didn't have a lack of, or they had a lack of urgency, I should say. They tended to take more time doing their stuff. And they had turmoil internally. They had 6 deaths before they ever reached the Sierra Nevada. And they made some really bad decisions. And probably the worst decision, in my opinion, the historians will give you lots of different views, but they took the road to death. And this was a term coined by J. Roderick Korn in 1951 in the book West of Fort Bridger. And this is the Hastings Cutoff. And just a quick show of hands, how many have heard of the Hastings Cutoff? A few, and that's expected. But before we dive in, and we are going to dive down on the trail, so I'm going to warn you ahead, this is going to get into some detail. Let's look at the general trail to California. It would start in either Independence or Council Bluffs, usually. It would head out across Kansas and Nebraska and go to Fort Laramie in Wyoming, cut across to Independence Rock in Wyoming, and then to the Big Sandy River. And early on, it would go down to Fort Bridger, back up to the Bear River, to Soda Springs, to Fort Hall, which was established by the British as a trading post. And then you would head down the Humboldt River into the Humboldt Sink, which is just pure desert. Then you would head up into the Sierra Nevada, and you would cross the Sierra Nevada at Truckee, and then into Sutter's Fort. And this was the trail that hundreds of thousands of people would follow over the next few years. And this was about 2,000 miles. And you look at it and you say, well, that doesn't look like 2,000 miles. But when you followed the rivers, it was 2,000 miles. And it, on average, in the early 1840s to the mid 1840s, took about 151.7 days to make that trip. So you had to be prepared. In 1844, there was a significant modification to that trail. The sublet cutoff was taken by the Stevens, Townsend, Murphy party, which cut across from at the Big Sandy through the Little Colorado Desert over to the Bear River, and this effectively cut off Fort Bridger. And this would be a major part in the story of the Hastings Cutoff, which was taken for the first time in 1846. So, pop quiz, get out your papers and pencils. Which of these parties took the Hastings Cutoff? Donner Party, definitely. Well, actually, the answer is all of the above. And as Jess Peterson would write in his 2018 Overland Journal article, when people hear about the Hastings Cutoff, they usually think about the Donner Party. But in fact, there were a bunch of parties that took that cutoff along with the Donners. There were about 100 wagons and over 400 people that took the cutoff. And many people just relate it strictly to the Donner Party. The Donners were only about 20% of the wagons and about 25% of the people that took the cutoff. So when I talk about the Hastings Cutoff, I have to talk about it, or I talk about it in terms of a saga, because it really is a saga. It starts with a young man by the name of Lansford W. Hastings, Lansford Warren Hastings. He was born in 1819 in Ohio. He was a lawyer. And in 1842, he decides to head out to Oregon because he has aspirations. He sees a great opportunity in the unsettled West. And outside of Fort Laramie, he meets a guy by the name of Thomas Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, an old fur trapper. The significance of this is his first encounter with a person who may have given him information about a potential cutoff. He heads on to Oregon and he decides he doesn't like it there. And in 1843, he leads a party of 53 people down to California, to Sutter's Fort. And Sutter's Fort was established by John Augustus Sutter in the early 1840s. He was a Swiss immigrant, and this was the destination. Now, what's interesting about this is an encounter between two people who have ideas about what the future of California should look like. And it doesn't take Hastings long to decide, I think there's an opportunity for me. And he sees himself potentially as the president of the California Territory. Now, this is not documented anywhere. This is speculation. But by all accounts, everybody pretty much believes he had aspirations to play a major role in the California Territory. He obtains a small land grant. And what do you need when you have land? You need people to settle it. So he heads to Mexico. And the story is he's heading there to talk to the Mexican government and try to get them to give up California. And then he's going to go to talk to Sam Houston in Texas and say, hey, Sam, how did you make all this happen? Well, he made it to Mexico and he talked to the American consuls there, but he never did talk to the Mexican government. And there's no record of him talking to Sam Houston. And in 1844, via New Orleans, he arrives in St. Louis, and the first thing he does is write a letter to Secretary of State John C. Calhoun. And he says, John, we're not happy out there in California. There's opportunity. You guys are not doing anything about it. If you don't get your act together, we're probably going to organize and maybe start a revolution of some sort. Calhoun basically throws a letter in the trash, and then in 1844, Polk is elected president, and Manifest Destiny takes over in 1846, and we know the story from there. So, in order to figure out how to get people to come to California, he writes a book. And this book is known as The Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. And this is maybe one of the most controversial books in all of the trails west in the 1800s. It was a guide. It's 155 pages long. I've read it. It's basically all but about 10 pages is useless. And it was panned by everybody. If you read Bernard DeVoto's statement, it's a man who wrote a book and had no idea what he was talking about. The Mexican government in California hated it. So I'll let you read it at your leisure. But there were two passages in this book which were really controversial. And the first one is wagons can be readily taken from Fort Hall to the Bay of St. Francisco, as it was called at the time. And in fact, the latter part of the route is found to be much more eligible for a wagon than the former. Only problem is Lansford Hastings had never taken that route. He had no idea. And the second was the most direct route from the California immigrants would be to leave the Oregon route about 200 miles east of Fort Hall, remember on the map, thence bearing southwest to the Salt Lake, and thence continuing down to the Bay of St. Francisco by the route just described. Well, once again, he had never seen this route. And if you are a Hastings antagonist, you will call this a cutoff. If you're a protagonist, you'll say, well, he was just giving some suggestions about stuff to think about. And in 1845, he publishes this guide. Now, this wasn't the first guide to be published, or it was probably the most significant, but in 1845, John Shively, on his return trip from Oregon, publishes a guide. It's only about 15 pages, and it's very useful. It gives distances and where to camp and so on, unlike Hastings, which was just a pontification on Oregon and California. Then he goes on a promotion tour into the east. He goes in Ohio and up to New York, and he meets a gentleman by the name of Sam Brannan, who is the president of the Mormon East and a publisher. He's a newspaper publisher, and he recognizes the power of the printed word. Now, actually, there's much more to this story, and we're not going to talk about it here, but it involved the Mormon Church. It involved Amos Kendall, an influence peddler, Thomas Farnham, a promoter, and a shipping company known as A.G. Benson that had some very interesting deals with the U.S. Navy, some under the cover deals. But there's a whole lot more that actually goes under this story. So now he finds out from Sam Brannan that there are 250 Mormons going on a ship, and they're going to go around South America and land in San Francisco, and they need, or Yerba Buena, and they need someplace to live. He's got a land grant. He invites them, I'll give you all your land, you can practice your religion. Freedom. And in order to do that, he's got to get back to California. So he goes back to St. Louis, and in August of 1845, he heads out on the trail to go back to Sutter's Fort. And remember, I told you it took 151.7 days. They were on horseback and they were going, but it was really a crazy thing to do. Now, the saga really includes some other people that we need to talk about. James Hudspeth, who went to Oregon with Hastings in 1842. He was an old mountaineer. Jim Bridger. Some of you may have heard of Jim Bridger, one of the most famous mountaineers of all time. If you've seen The Revenant and Hugh Glass, the young boy that thought about helping Hugh Glass after he got mauled by the bear, that was Jim Bridger. Louis Vasquez, a fur trapper and partner of Bridger's, and none other than John C. Fremont. I can't imagine there's a person in this room that has not heard that name. So in 1846, a couple of faithful meetings may have occurred. Now you're going to hear me say may several times because there's no official record that these meetings ever occurred. But these meetings may have occurred between Hastings and Fremont, and then Hastings and Theodore Talbot. So let's back up a little and see how those people actually got to California at the same time. Fremont's expedition started in 1845 in Independence, Missouri. He headed out across Kansas and Colorado. And if you'll notice, he goes right south of the Great Salt Lake and across that little white spot there, which is the Great Salt Desert. There's a guy with him by the name of Joseph Walker, another very famous fur trapper and guide, who actually leads him across that Great Salt Desert. They split there. Fremont goes on up to the Humboldt River. He goes straight across, and Talbot goes up to the Humboldt River. They meet again at Walker Lake and split. Fremont goes on to Sutter Fort, arriving at December 10th, and Talbot will arrive in March. In the meantime, our good friend, Lansford W. Hastings, remember I said he left August 15th, he starts racing across the country. He gets to Fort Laramie, and he finds out that the Sioux Nation is on the warpath. And they tell him, absolutely, do not go any farther west. It's certain death. He meets our friend, Jim Bridger. Now, remember Fort Bridger down there? Jim says, I tell you what, I will take you through an alternate route and get you to Fort Bridger, which they do through the Wind River Mountains. And it takes them almost 3 weeks to do that. So now we have Hastings with Bridger for a 3-week period. Bridger has been all over the West pretty much. So Hastings now has a sense of kind of the lay of the land, so to speak. He then heads out and he goes on and he crosses the Sierra. And if you notice that snowflake, he crossed the Sierra 2 days before a massive snowstorm shut it. So if he had been 2 days earlier, he probably would have been stuck on the east side of the Sierra Nevada, and we'd probably never heard of the Donner Party. So we get back to our meetings, and it's believed that Hastings and Fremont had a meeting. If those of you that know Fremont, he was quite eloquent in his speech. He sometimes was known to inflate things slightly, and it's believed that he convinced Hastings that there was a cutoff that was viable to take. Same thing maybe with Talbot, but Talbot I think was a little more practical. But what we do know for a fact is in June 1845 is that the Weston Expositor writes an article that Fremont is going on his 3rd expedition, and he's looking for a shortcut to California that's going to save 300 to 400 miles. In January 1846, he actually writes a letter to his wife talking about this wonderful route he has just discovered. The land is flat, plenty of water, plenty of grass, saved him a whole bunch of time. In 1846, Hastings changes his plans. He's actually going to go to Oregon, get some settlers and bring them down because he knows the Mormons are going to take a while to get there. He's very anxious to start settling California. And in 1846, he heads east. And as he does that, he starts leveraging Fremont's names. So let's look at that eastbound journey. April 11th, 1846, Hastings, along with a mountain man, James Clyman, another very famous one, Caleb Old Greenwood. This guy was 82 years old at this time. And James Husband head east. On May 21st, they get to the Secret Pass, and they get into an argument. Clyman, Greenwood want to go on to Fort Hall. Hastings is determined to go across the Great Salt Desert on to Fort Bridger. And by whatever means, he convinced Clyman to go with him. So they head out and go to Fort Bridger, arriving there on June 7th. Hastings then heads on east into the South Pass of the Rockies. And he starts advertising his route. And we know that from the fact that in some interviews that J. Quinn Thornton did in 1848, he talks about this much nearer and better route via Fort Hall than the one via Fort Hall. It's really good, lots of water, except for one dry drive of about 35 or 40 miles at the most. And they would have no difficult canyons to pass, and the road was generally good and hard and level. We also know at this time he hired a guy by the name of Wells Bonney, a single horseman coming out of Oregon back east with somewhat of a shady reputation. It was believed that he killed a person and he was fleeing from the law. And he hires him to take a letter. And that letter is basically saying, hey, here's all the goodness I'm about to show you. Now, what's significant about this is he is promoting this route that we just talked about. It's materially shorter, it's better. And this was from a person actually going westbound by the name of Edwin Bryant, a journalist who had actually encountered Wells Bonney and read the letter. The significance is on July 12th, Wells Bonney encounters the Donner Party headed west. And he tells them, hey, I got this great route. So this is really the first encounter where we know that they've been invited to take this route. Kleiman and Greenwood, in the meantime, head eastbound, and they go on over to Fort Laramie. Now, the second set of fateful meetings occurs on June 27th at Fort Laramie. James Fraser Reed meets James Kleiman. Remember, Kleiman just crossed the Great Salt Desert. Now, again, this is one of these may have, because we don't know that he actually had this meeting. He references that he met Milburn Boggs, the ex-governor of Missouri, but he doesn't mention James Fraser Reed. It's not until 1871, when he's dictating his memoirs to Bancroft, that he actually mentions my old buddy James Fraser Reed, who I fought with in the Black Hawk War. So could have had another warning. Also, Edwin Bryant, that I mentioned, who was traveling with William Al Russell, they decide that they're going to take the cutoff, but they exchange their wagons for pack mules because they've got the idea that, one, they're moving too slow, and to make this trek, they're going to have to take a different mode of operation. So they go for pack mules. And then finally, we have three other guys, Caleb Old Greenwood. Remember Joseph Walker, who led Fremont? He shows up at Fort Laramie driving 500 cattle east that he's going to sell to the U.S. And with him is Solomon Sublette, one of the 5 Sublette brothers, who also has been in this whole area and understands it. And on July 17th, Edwin Bryant meets Joseph Walker right outside of Fort Laramie. And Walker basically tells him, hey, this is not a good idea. Do not take this route. And so this prompts Bryant to write a series of letters that he's going to leave at Fort Bridger. Now, here are his words from his diary.
Although such was my own determination, I wrote several letters to my friends among the emigrants in the rear, advising them not to take this route, but to keep on the old trail via Fort Hall. Our situation was different from theirs. We are mounted on mules, had no families, and could afford to hazard experiments and make explorations. They could not. Edwin Bryant, July 18th, 1846.
Now you'll notice he never mentions that he left them. He just says he wrote some letters. And this is probably another one of the most controversial elements of the whole Hastings Cutoff story, is did Bridger and Vasquez withhold those letters? James Fraser Reed will claim many years later that they did, but there's no record of it. So, despite all of those warnings, guess what? Those 400 people that we just talked about head on out to Fort Bridger. And the Donner Reed party, I call them the Donner Reed because they were the collection of the Donners and the Reeds at that time, arrives on July 28th. By this time, the other parties have already departed. So remember I told you the Donner party was a little slower than the others? They were. And by the 26th, the Hoppy party had already left and all the others were ahead of them. So now, on July 31st, finally, the Donner party or Donner Reed party heads out across this Hastings Cutoff. And we're going to jump down into this and look at it in pretty good detail here, because I think it's very important just to show how messed up this got. There's really 5 parts to this. We're only going to talk about 2. One is going across the Wasatch Mountains, and the other is the Great Salt Desert. So here is the layout of the Wasatch Mountains, and very quickly, there are several points of interest: Devil Gates, the Upper Weber Canyon, East Narrow Canyons and Big Mountains. And then there's the Weber River flowing northwest and the East Canyon Creek flowing northwest, and two entrances, the Lost Creek and Echo Canyon. So now that you've kind of got the lay of the land, we're actually going to walk through them coming through these mountains. On June 2nd, Hastings, Clyman, and Hudspeth cross eastbound, going to Fort Bridger. And by all beliefs, everybody that's ever, I think, seen this says the intent was that Hastings was just simply going to lead them right back across this same path. But that's not what happened. Here's actually what happened. So all these different lines are all the different paths these parties took. And there's really two big factors in here. One was the advice that James Hudspeth gave, and two was the fact that Hastings was absent for most of this time. So now we're actually going to follow them through. On July 23rd, the Bryant-Russell party enters via Lost Creek, and after about a day, they get some advice from some Native Americans that tell them to go up this East Canyon Narrows. This in itself is extremely treacherous. At one point, they're 300 feet above the river on a little horse trail, about this wide apparently, and Edwin Bryant writes about how treacherous that was. On the morning of July 25th, James Hudspeth rides on down through Devil's Gate to check out the lower part of the canyon, and then in the evening he comes back. On the 26th, he heads back up the canyon to survey it, and the Bryant-Russell party, remember, they're on mules, they go on through Devil's Gate. On the 27th, the Bryant-Russell party camps at the mouth of the river, and James Hudspeth encounters the Harlan Young party entering through Echo Canyon. Now, this is kind of where the advice maybe comes in, because as Edwin Bryant wrote, Mr. Hudspeth, who had a small party, would start in advance and do some exploration of the route. So we're not sure if Hastings and Hudspeth had an agreement, but whatever means it was, James Hudspeth convinced the Harlan and Young party to go back up the river. So on July 28th, Hudspeth rides back to rejoin his party. Harlan and Young camps around Henneford. On July 29th, Bryant-Russell party heads out into the Salt Lake Valley. The Harlan and Young enters the Weber Canyon, and we see the Mathers family enter via Echo Canyon. On the 30th, the Bryant-Russell exits down the valley. Harlan and Young starts going through the Devil's Gate, and the Mathers family camps around Morgan. On the 31st, we see the Harlan and Young party entering Devil's Gate. The Mathers family moves on up into Morgan. We see on the 1st, Bryant-Russell exits Salt Lake Valley. Harlan and Young is still working through Devil's Gate. We see the Mathers family camp behind them. The Hoppy party enters the Weber River, and over there on the right, we see Lansford Hastings show up on the scene finally. Where has he been? He's been back up towards Fort Bridger trying to pick up stragglers and find a better way into the mountains. On August 2nd, Lansford Hastings catches up with the Harlan and Young party and tries to convince them to do something different. And the reason being is this is what he sees. This is Devil's Gate. Doesn't look like that today because of all the highway construction and everything, but this is in the 1800s. And you can see the terrain they were dealing with. And at several places, they had to actually build windlasses, pull the wagons up onto paths they had cut across on the side of the canyon and try to take them across. At one point, they were on a little path about 80 feet above the river. They were holding the wagons with ropes. One of the ropes broke the wagon, and 6 oxen plunged 80 feet into the river and died. Kind of interesting comment by James Mather came up behind him.
Went down and examined the pass and found it to be impracticable for wagons to go through, although a number of men were at work removing all rocks that were not immovable and digging down hills to make a way over. An exhibition of consummate folly. James Mathers, August 2nd, 1846.
So on August 3rd, Lansford Hastings starts racing back up the river, and he passes the Mathers family, who says, we're going to stick with the route we're on. He sees the Hoppy party, tries to convince them to turn around and follow his route. On August 4th, the Harlan and Young finally clears Devil's Gate and exits the river. The Mathers family starts working through. The Hoppy party actually does back up a few miles, and they send out a scouting party to check out Hastings' route, but they decide not to take it. And it's here that Hastings leaves a note on a stick next to the river and says, hey, when you get here, ride forward, come find me. I will show you a better route to take. August 5th, the Harlan and Young clears the Jordan River. The Mathers family finally makes it through. The Hoppy party splits in two, part of them going through Devil's Gate, part of them camp, and we see the Donna Reed party entering the canyon. On August 6th, Harlan Young exits. Hoppy, the Mathers move down the valley, and we see the Donna Reed finds the note. On August 7th, we see Mathers and Hoppy pretty much clearing the valley, and we see James Fraser Reed, Charles Stanton, and William Pike racing forward on horses through the Weber River to catch up with Hastings, which they do on August 8th near Adobe Rock. And Hastings does agree to come back with James Fraser Reed and show him a better route. So on August 9th, they go back and they camp right around present-day Salt Lake City. On the morning of August 10th, they scale Big Mountain, which is about 8,458 feet high. And it's here that Hastings says, well, maybe not. I really need to go back and take the Harlan and Young party on forward. But I tell you what, I'll show you the route. So he points, he says, if you go over there and see that mountain and you see that valley, take that, follow it, and you'll be okay. Good directions. On the evening of August 10th, Lansford Hastings heads out the valley, and James Fraser Reed rejoins the Donna Reed party near Hennifer, and they have a discussion, and he convinces them to take the route that Hastings just described. On August 11th, they start their journey through the Wasatch Mountains. Now, this is what they're faced with. I don't know if you've ever been to Salt Lake City and the mountains surrounding. Those of you have, you know they're very beautiful mountains, but they're very rugged. There are 29 peaks in the Wasatch Mountains, over 11,000 feet. The route that the Donners are about to take averages about 7,500 to 8,500 feet high. Very brushy, lots of underbrush, lots of trees. But on August 11th, they head out and they start hacking and carving their way through the Wasatch Mountains. They move about a mile at best. They camp, they move another mile, hack the road. And finally, on August 22nd, they exit the Wasatch Mountains after 11 days of crossing them. They spend a couple of days resting. They enter what's known as Skull Valley, just south of the Great Salt Lake. And here a couple of things happen. There are two deaths that occur. John Hargrave of the Harlan and Young party, a young man, dies of consumption. And Luke Holleran, the young man that the Donners picked up, Tamsin Donner picked up and cared for in the South Pass, also passes away. And they're buried somewhere in North Skull Valley around 20 Wells, but we don't know where their grave sites are. The other significant event is at Iosapa, they find the remnants of a note that was attached to a board. It was picked apart by birds. Tamsin Donner meticulously takes that note and puts it back together. And here's what she reads. 2 days, 2 nights, hard driving, cross desert, reach water. This was left by Lansford Hastings, telling them that that's what they were faced with. On August 31st, they reached Hastings Pass at the base of the Cedar Mountains. Now, the Cedar Mountains in Skull Valley is a very rough, rugged place. It is dry, arid, it is scrub brush, sagebrush, scorpions, very little wildlife, very hot. And Edwin Bryant on August 3rd was camped there just about to go over the pass. And let's hear him describe it.
There was no voice of animal, no hum of insect disturbing the tomb-like solemnity. All was silence and death. The atmosphere, chill and frosty, seemed to sympathize with this sepulchral stillness. No wailing or whispering sounds sighed through the chasms of the mountains or over the gulfy and waterless ravines of the valley. Edwin Bryant, August 3rd, 1846.
Probably a place you wouldn't want to go camping just for the fun of it, trust me. But about 4 o'clock in the morning, they pack up their mules, they get ready, they head up over Hastings Pass, over the Cedar Mountains, and when they get to the top, this is what they see. Now at this point, James Hudspeth, who is leading them, this is as far as he's agreed to take them. He and his 2 companions get on their horses, and they're riding off, and as he's riding off, he turns back over his shoulder and he says, "Now boys, put spurs to your mules and ride like hell." The only problem was hell was another 75 miles wide. So that one little stretch of 30, maybe 40 miles that Hastings had referred to, actually was 80 miles. So if you weren't prepared to cross this, it was going to be an experience. One interesting
Morning came at last, and such a sight. The sun rose in full splendor, reflecting his rays on this vast salt plain, as white as snow, and as far as the eye could reach not a thing to be seen, not a spear of grass or a drop of water, and the end could not be detected by the eye. The stock was showing great signs of fatigue. A little hay and some water revived them, and a cup of coffee and a cold snack had as good effect on the migrants. It was a blessing that they were ignorant of what was before them. Harlan and Young Party, August 1846.
So they were about 12 miles into the journey across the Great Salt Desert at this point, and this was their reflection about what they were facing at that point. So this would become known as the Fearful Long Drive. It was given this name by Thomas H. Jefferson, a cartographer, with the Hopi Party. And this was marked by some awful stuff. Extreme heat and cold. It was very hot during the day, but as is in the desert, it was very cold. In fact, at one point, James Fraser Reed took the 5 family dogs and placed them around his children to try to keep them warm. Thirst and dehydration. Now, the water in Skull Valley is very brackish. I mean, you actually literally almost have to scoop it up with your hands if you can't find a well because of all the outpouring of the Great Salt Lake. And they barely had enough water for themselves and had not nearly enough water for their oxen and livestock. Blinding dust and salt storms. They were talking about the salt being caked on their face. Confusion. At one point, the Bryant Russell Party saw this beautiful shimmering lake up to the northeast, and they thought that was the Great Salt Lake and thought they were headed in the wrong direction, and they were about to turn south and go into the middle of the Great Salt Desert. They finally realized it was a mirage and kept going straight. Hallucinations. At one point, they talked about seeing these monsters in front of them that were waving their hands, and they were mimicking everything that they were doing. It turns out it was just their shadows. They were so delirious at this point. Loss of oxen and livestock. At some points, you have to understand the geography of this area, but this is just a crust that's over a layer of mud. And the oxen would step through and sink up to their knees. through this crust, and they would just simply stop and die. In fact, James Fraser Reed lost 36 of his livestock, including all of his oxen except one and one cow. Wagons broken and abandoned. At one point, Heinrich Leonhard counted 24 wagons that had been abandoned as he was going across. They had to come back and get them. James Fraser Reed would lose 2 of his 3 wagons, including the infamous Pioneer Palace car. And Heinrich Leonhard would relate that the oxen were so delirious in trying to get into the shade that they would try to get into the shade of the wagon next to them. They would get their horns caught in the wagon wheels and either break the spokes in the wagon wheels or break their horns off. Total exhaustion. I mean, not only the livestock that just literally laid down and died, but the people were close to the same thing. And then shattered morale. I mean, this had basically devastated them. But on September 4th, the Donner Reed party makes it to Pilot Peak. So they've now crossed the Great Salt Desert. And you would think Pilot Peak would be this nice, beautiful spring, Pilot Spring. It was actually just a hole in the water, or hole in the ground that water seeped up through that was fairly brackish. But the key thing was, after the 3rd day they were camped at Pilot Peak, they looked out, and as in this picture, they saw snow in the mountains. So on September 26th, finally, the Donner Reed party reaches the Humboldt River. And the irony of this is that this little red line is the line that Hastings and Hudspeth and Kleiman took going eastbound, and the Bryant Russell party would take going westbound. But Hastings led them south of the Ruby Mountains, as you can see by the black line, and it added another 80 miles to the trip. To put this in perspective, the Cooper Gregg party that was 4 days ahead of the Donner Reed party at the Sublet Cutoff reached the South Fork Junction on August 22nd, basically a month earlier than the Donner Reed's party reached the cutoff. So the dynamics at work in all this, these are some of my thoughts. You know, the Immigrant's Guide, a lot of people say, oh my gosh, the Donner and the Reeds read this cover to cover to cover and believed every word of it. There's only one existing copy of this guide. It belonged to George McKinstry, who actually hired the Donner Reed party to take his belongings in their wagons across the Sierra. That was the only copy that was brought out, so we have no clue that James Fraser Reed or George Donner or Jacob Donner ever read it. Fremont's impact on Hastings, if they did have those meetings, I really believe it did. Knowing what I read, I'm not a historian, but the little I have read about Fremont, I believe it. The eastbound party's negativity towards California. Believe it or not, people went to California and they came back because they didn't like it. And the people coming back were fairly vocal, and it's believed that their negativity may have put some of the westbound travelers off and they just ignored their warnings. Bridger's personal motives of trying to keep business flowing through Fort Bridger? Probably. I hate to think that, because if you ever read anything about Jim Bridger, you'll understand the impact he made on the American West and the Native Americans advocating for their rights. The Donner Reed party's lack of leadership. I mean, they had good people. They were organized and they had good stuff. But, you know, were they overconfident? At one point, James Fraser Reed would write a letter back on July 31st. It would be published in the Sangamo Journal. And he's saying, hey, we're only 250 miles from California. And this is going to save us 350 miles to 400 miles. And if we go the Fort Hall route, it's going to be 750. So I think they were misguided. Hudspeth, you know, there was a belief that Hudspeth was trying to find his own pass through from the Rockies down to the Great Basin. And then Hastings, avarice, or overzealous. I don't think we'll ever know. There's arguments on both sides. So this is called the parting of the ways. And this is where you would take the right-hand route and you'd go north to Fort Hall, and you'd take the left-hand route and you'd go to Fort Bridger. And if this route to get to the Humboldt Cutoff or the Humboldt Junction was 417 miles, and the proposed shortcut that Lansford Hastings was touting was 497 miles. This was a warning in the California Star in 1848 that said, you know, keep to the well-defined old road to California. The fate of those who deviated from the old road to try the shortcuts, so alluring to way-worn travelers, is sufficient warning. And he's referring to the Donner Party, or they are referring to the Donner Party. So what happened to our friend, Lansford W. Hastings? Well, in 1846, he follows Fremont through California during the U.S.-Mexican War. He actually becomes a captain. And interestingly enough, several of the members of the parties that followed him through the Hastings Cutoff served under him and spoke very highly of him. It's rumored that he and James Fraser Reed had a cattle agreement at one point. So it wasn't until the real horror of the Donner Party story came out that his notoriety really began. 1847, he moves to San Francisco and publishes 5 more versions of his guide, it was the worst of all of them. 1848, he's elected a school trustee in San Francisco. 49, he's appointed a judge in the Northern California district, dabbles in the gold business, and he leaves his mark on history. And I'll read this to you because it's a little bit hard to read, but it says, signature state where born residents and age of delegate convened in General Convention on the first day of September 1849 to frame a state constitution from California. Lots of important names on here. Robert Semple, Vallejo, Mariano Castro, you'll just, all the delegates there. But about third on the list is a name you can't really read, and it's a young man from Ohio, about 30 years of age. And it's none other than our friend Lansford W. Hastings. And Elijah Oscar Crosby spoke very highly of him. Quite a frontiersman, considerable knowledge of the geography of the country, was much service to the body. If you're ever wondering why the eastern boundary of California looks like it does, you can thank that man right there. He chaired the committee that set the boundaries for California. He would go on to secure a postmaster of Fort Yuma in the Arizona Territory. He never gave up scheming. In 1861, he writes a letter to Brigham Young proposing to take control of the Colorado River and control the commerce on the Colorado River, which, if you know the Colorado River, is not really made for commerce. He joins the Confederate Army and proposes a plan to Jefferson Davis to conquer the Southwest and California and take it into the Confederacy. In 1867, he writes The Immigrant's Guide to Brazil, and he establishes a Confederate colony in Brazil. And to this day, on the 4th of July, the people of that colony dress up in American garb and celebrate the 4th of July. And somewhere between 1868 and 1870, he dies on board a ship, taking some more Confederates to his colony in Brazil. Suggested readings on all of this. I've got a list here. There are some lists up here that you're welcome to take. There's also some maps up here if you're interested in just kind of looking at the trail of this. But What I Saw in California by Edwin Bryant is a great day-to-day journal. From St. Louis to Sutter's Fort by Heinrich Leonhardt is another day-by-day journal. And then Overland in 1846, and I mentioned West from Fort Bridger by Corns and Morgan. Excellent references. And with that, I thank you.